Hey, thank you all so much for being here in this really busy time of the semester. For those who don't know me, I'm Shireen Hamdi, and I'm an associate professor in anthropology. And I'm really honored to be introducing Dr. Benjamin Dix for this really special event. Dr. Dix is a senior lecturer at SOAS, University of London, and he's here with us at Brown for a week thanks to the Kogut Humanities Center, the World at Brown program, which funds an international scholar to be with us here for a whole week. So on Tuesday, Dr. Dix is going to be hosting a workshop upstairs in the McKinney Conference Room, and on Wednesday at noon, we're doing a joint event with RISD. And so for that, I'd like to thank Professor Amanda Anderson at the Kogut Humanities Center and Kit Salisbury for her administrative help. Dr. Dix has a diverse background. Before pursuing his doctoral degree in anthropology, he had worked as a communications manager for the United Nations and other NGOs for 12 years in various countries across Asia and Africa. He was based in northern Sri Lanka with the UN from 2004 to 2008 during the conflict. When he was there in Sri Lanka, as I'm sure he's going to tell us, he read Art Spiegelman's now classic graphic novel Maus about Spiegelman's father, a Holocaust survivor, and his experiences escaping to safety from Nazi control. As Ben is sure to tell us, this promoted him to think of the power of sequential art to highlight humanitarian and human rights issues in ways that transcend other conventional forms, such as prose, film, or photography. In 2012, Ben founded the organization Positive Negatives, which produces comics for pedagogical and journalistic purposes, raising awareness on issues of forced migration, asylum, and political conflict. Positive Negatives also launched an educational charity called Y Comics in 2016, which produces free educational resources to be adapted in both primary and secondary schools, also featuring global humanitarian and social issues such as racism, migration, climate change, conflict, bullying, and trafficking. Dr. Dix earned his PhD from the University of Sussex in 2016 and was recently awarded a senior lectureship at the School of Oriental and Asian Studies, where I discovered he now occupies the former office of T.S. Eliot. In my capacity as series editor of the new ethnographic series through the University of Toronto Press, which seeks to combine anthropology with sequential art, I've had the pleasure of reading Dr. Dix's book proposal based on his PhD called Escape from Terror, featuring harrowing stories of families fleeing the political violence between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers that Ben connected in the Vani when he was working as a UN operative from 2004 to 2008, combined with interviews from 2011 to 2015 with migrants who were displaced by the recent civil war who are now living in India, Switzerland, and Britain. I'm excited now to hear him tell us about how he collaborates and co-constructs these stories with the refugees and asylum seekers and collaborates with artists from around the world. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Dix.
Thank you very much, Shireen, for that lovely introduction. It's sometimes you get introductions where you don't really know how to follow on. I kind of feel that we've covered everything already. But thank you very much for having me here, and it's a real great honour to be here today and present this work to you. So I'm going to give a presentation which really covers kind of three stages of why I'm standing here talking to you all about comics as someone who doesn't really have a background in comics, and I can't draw. Even my stick men are terrible. The methodologies that I kind of created through my PhD, and then some of the examples of the work that we've been doing with Positive Negatives and now Y Comics at SOAS. So to go straight into it, the story really begins in 2004 when I just finished my undergrad at SOAS, and I went to India as a photojournalist. I was working for a publication there when the tsunami hit on Boxing Day of 2004. And an old friend, James, was in northern Sri Lanka in the Vani, working in the Tamil Tiger region, and kind of gave me a call to say, will you come over and help me out? There's been this massive disaster. I think we remember back at that time, we didn't really even know what the word tsunami meant. It was a new kind of phenomenon almost to our generation. And so I went over for about 10 days and ended up staying in the Vani there in North Sri Lanka for 4 years. And it was one of those decisions in life that completely changed the course of my life, as I found myself in an absolutely stunningly beautiful but incredibly impoverished area of the island nation of Sri Lanka. It was environmentally beautiful and a fascinating place to suddenly be after this massive disaster as well, but also politically and culturally it was very interesting that there had been a 30-year protracted war there between the rebel group of the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan state. And so as I started traveling around and meeting these communities in that area called the Vanni, I was meeting people who were, had issues with landmines and couldn't get out into the agricultural fields, couldn't use industries and road networks because of the landmines. And culturally, I was finding almost every family had a family member who was a Tamil Tiger, and therefore there was this very blurred line, which is almost symbolized by the sun there, between the Tamil civilian and the Tiger rebel. And so I got to know this community more and more, and I guess I was an anthropologist at heart even before I started studying anthropology, and I would go out and spend huge amounts of time meeting communities, and getting to know, making friends in that community. And I felt incredibly at home there. It was a very welcoming and humbling community of the Tamil society. And in 2007, the conflict really started to step up a gear between the Tigers and the Sri Lankan state. And I started going out into war-affected villages and meeting families like this, where this child, his house had been shelled by artillery the night before, and he was completely shell-shocked, and he had lost his mother and his sister, and his father was packing up their belongings and making their first displacement away from home. And I guess it was the first time that I had really seen and witnessed conflict up front. I don't think I was particularly prepared for it. I'd had no training in conflict. I certainly wasn't a soldier or anything like this, and I was seeing these events unfold in front of me, and it was incredibly distressing. And as the United Nations, we were scrambling around. Our area of security was getting smaller and smaller as the conflict spiraled. And it was an incredibly intense and distressing time to be working through. What I started to see as well was these kind of notions of migration and internal displacement for the first time, where people could feel the army, the Sri Lankan army, encroaching from the south, and the tightening grip of the Tamil Tigers around this community of recruitment of civilians. And people had these, at first, these decisions, they had time and space, maybe some money to be able to make informed decisions of moving away from their homes for the first time. And so we saw lots of scenes of people packing up their belongings on tractors and making that informed decision to leave their home. But then as the conflict caught up with them and the army was encroaching further and further into their area, their lack of being able to earn money, their livelihoods was getting severed, and they would suddenly turn from one family on a tractor with all their belongings to a whole village on a tractor with hardly any belongings. And we started to see the spiraling of vulnerability, and that then increased things like alcoholism, mental health, gender-based violence, these kind of issues that I had never really engaged or read so much about within the conflict setting. And this then spiraled up until 2008 into complete chaos, where there was about 400,000 internally displaced people moving around the Vanni. And one of my roles as the communications and liaison officer with the UN was to have daily meetings with the Tamil Tigers. There was a lot of recruitment of our staff. Our administrative staff at the UN were being recruited by the Tigers because they were the educated people within the community. And so I was having daily meetings with them to try and get our staff back out of the clutches of the Tigers. And it became an incredibly stressful role. We spent lots of time in the bunker, and it was in this bunker that maybe six hours a day under air attack, under artillery attack. And one day one of my colleagues handed me Art Spiegelman's Maus. I'd never read a graphic novel before. I think I had read some Calvin and Hobbes sitting on the toilet one day, when I was a kid, and some copies of the Beano. But I sat there and I read Maus cover to cover, and I was absolutely fascinated and inspired by how you could take such a complex and traumatic issue like the Holocaust and present it as a piece of sequential art. And I came out of the bunker that evening having read the entirety of Maus, and kind of looked around and had one of those kind of eureka moments of thinking, actually, this could be a graphic novel here in Sri Lanka. We have the UN, we have the Sri Lankan Air Force flying around, the 400,000 internally displaced people, the Tamil Tiger rebels. This is a graphic novel. I was a bit busy at that time, kind of in the conflict, so I kind of parked that idea. And I was constantly being hit by the different spaces that we occupied in the conflict, that sitting here in the UN in a reinforced bunker was incredibly different to what the civilians were experiencing just outside our gates, a completely different space. I was able to sit and read a novel. This was the experience of the civilians. And so in September 2008, the UN evacuated and we had to start closing up our offices and moving out. And this was the worst moment of my life. I mean, it was another period that completely changed the course of my life. This was one of the last photos I took in the field that I think really highlighted the vulnerability of how we were leaving 400,000 civilians. And one started to question as a UN practitioner of how to, the responsibility to protect civilians in conflict and how we were evacuating and leaving them. And more so, the fact that at that point our space of humanitarian operations had shrunk so much that we weren't really supplying or giving so much humanitarian need and supplies to these people, but it was more that we were the independent witness of what was happening in this conflict, that civilians were being recruited by a rebel group and they were being shelled by a state government. And as soon as we removed, that independent witness disappeared. And that was something that was incredibly troubling, because we know in the dark spots of the world, that's when the really troublesome things happen. And so on September the 18th, 2008, we evacuated, and I was in the last car driving out of there. And this was a moment that was profoundly devastating for me. It's a community that I'd lived with for 4 years, a community that I'd built friendships and relationships with. You were suddenly hugging them goodbye, wishing them good luck, and you drove out of there. And it was one of those moments that I hope none of us have to live through. But I left there. I quit my job as the UN the next day, and I flew out of Sri Lanka. I came back to the UK, and over the next 6-7 months, 34 of my colleagues died, and these were Tamil civilians and UN workers that we left behind. And over 146,679 people were missing, which, 10 years on in an island the size of Sri Lanka means probably that is around the death toll of this conflict. And that's a huge death toll for a modern day conflict. And Sri Lanka was a conflict that wasn't particularly spoken about much in the media. People didn't really know. Even when we evacuated from the north, there were Europeans having honeymoons on the south beaches of Sri Lanka, and this is a tiny island. And so the propaganda machine and the way that the Sri Lankan state and the international community kind of spun the conflict, it really wasn't, there wasn't a huge refugee crisis. There's no oil fields in the north of Sri Lanka. These are things that are kind of attributed to the silencing of this conflict. So I'm sitting back in England and I'm receiving all of these emails about my lost friends and colleagues. And I started to revisit the idea of the graphic novel, of how do you tell these stories in a different way, not in a report that will only be shared amongst a particular community of people, but in a way that general audiences and far wider audiences will engage with this conflict. So I started working with this fantastic illustrator called Lindsay Pollock, who is a friend of a friend from my days at SOAS. And he lived in North London, and he was a comic book artist. And I mean, bless him, up until the point where I met him, he was illustrating children's books, and I kind of brought a genocide to him, and 5 years later, in fact, I think he's watching now live streaming, so thanks, Lindsay, and he's actually sitting at his desk at the moment continuing to draw this project 5 years later. And so we went through this process of how do we start to tell this story of the conflict in Sri Lanka and then the migration to Europe as refugees. And a professor at Sussex University, Raminda Kaur, kind of slightly convinced me to do this as a PhD. I was slightly resistant to it at first, and I agreed, and we went into it as a PhD to really start to look at the responsibility of how you take very complex, traumatic testimonies of people who have lived through a conflict such as this, who are now refugees, asylum seekers spread around the world, and turn their testimonies into sequential art. So I got an apartment in Delhi, back in India, and started to map out this story, this narrative, and started to work with Sri Lankan survivors who were predominantly in London, Zurich, and Chennai, India, and built a kind of participatory methodology where I would sit with the respondent for 2 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, and really get to know them as a person, not just about the conflict, but who they were as a child, what their characters were growing up, and really, you know, share a lot of my own personal story with them and make a bond with this person. And then once I've got all of this information, I would take it and start to write the script for the graphic novel. I'd go through the script and take it back to them, and they would have a space to edit, comment, and shape this script with me, that it's their story. And what I wanted to try and reduce was my interpretation of their story and allow them to really give the space to tell their experiences of life. We would then go through the artwork, and because of security issues, suddenly I was finding the graphic novel and the illustrated drawings an amazing space to be able to tell people's stories without compromising their security. And this is in a conflict like Sri Lanka, when even when people have escaped to London or Zurich, they still have family members back in Sri Lanka, and the persecution of the state on those family members could be high. So suddenly taking one of my photographs and illustrating it like this completely anonymized the respondent, and we were able to really start telling their stories and their testimonies through this art. And then with the artwork, we would then take that back to the respondent and get their impressions of the artwork. And, you know, we get things like you've drawn mountains in the background and actually my area was a flat area, or you've drawn my childhood home way too big. It was a small little bamboo hut in the jungle, these kind of issues. So once we've got the script and the artwork right with the respondents, then we started to ink it. And Lindsay was doing this incredible job. He's a guy who had never been to Sri Lanka. I wasn't allowed back from 2009 onwards, and so I took Lindsay down to South India, and I basically strapped him to the back of a motorbike and roared him around the interiors of South India so that he could see what places like North Sri Lanka look like, the palmyra trees, the motorbikes. He was always concerned, like, how do a family of 7 people fit on one motorbike? Where do all the legs go? So it's kind of like that kind of stuff he needed to see and feel and understand so that he could really start to draw this work. And then we started plotting out this narrative of pre-tsunami, of the ordinary life. It was by no means idyllic. They were still living in an area controlled by a Tamil Tiger rebels. It was politically very sensitive. There was this protracted war that had an on and off peace process going through. But it was a simple, lovely life for people of going out fishing in the nighttime, coming back with the night's fish, and living with your family and the small community in this very isolated area. And so Lindsay really started to kind of show this world of the life and experiences of people pre-tsunami. And then in 2004, the tsunami hit, and I arrived about 3 days after this experience. And so I arrived to the devastation of this, but people were telling me, like my driver who started working for me at the UN, he was at the top of one of these palmera trees, and we measured it, and it was 17 meters high. And when he saw the wave come in, he climbed up to the top of the palmera tree, and his feet were in the water. So we could really start to see just the mass devastation that this tsunami caused. And then what life was like after the tsunami, which is kind of when I got there and finding people just completely devastated in this area that had just wiped out their whole villages in a matter of seconds. And going through the conflict, then displaced from the tsunami, to then we can start to see the first jets flying over and the bombardments. So this is about a year and a half after the tsunami. The Sri Lankan state and the Tamil Tigers started to fight again, and how people had to leave their already kind of refugee camps from the tsunami and displace again and again, like we saw the photos of the tractor earlier. And here we would use this photographic documentation that I'd taken, and Lindsay would be constantly referencing against the photographs and bringing them into the illustrated narrative. And what we started to find with the illustrations, the graphic narratives, is that they could take you into these spaces that other mediums really couldn't. And it was stuff that I always struggled with as a photographer, is how do you show people's memories? And this is something that I found so wonderful with reading Maus, was that you can suddenly transcend time and space in a graphic novel. And so this is a story, a kind of micro story within the graphic novel on Sri Lanka of a guy, Indran, who's stuck in the bunker with his family, and he's always fighting with his teenage son, because after months and months of being on this battle zone, his teenage son still wants to wander around. It becomes normal life, and he wants to move around and go and see his friends, and the father is constantly keeping him in the bunker because he's seen what these shells do. And the illustrated narrative can take you into that space to see what's the images inside this guy's head of why he's trying to protect. But it also takes you into just the normal day life of day after day after day living in a refugee camp, living in a conflict zone. And there are quiet times. There are times when just a family will sit round a fireplace, that they'll reminisce about the life back home before the conflict. And again, the illustrated narrative will demonstrate that and show the humanity behind living through such a horrific moment. It also can show war crimes, and this is stuff that I worked on with Channel 4 in the UK, a film called No Fire Zone, which is about the conflict in Sri Lanka, and we built this documentary out of video footage taken by the Sri Lankan Tamils through the conflict after we left, and then also by the Sri Lankan state as victory footage of them executing Tamil Tigers. And so it was images like this. This is a screenshot from a film. And I didn't want to show you the film because it's incredibly distressing, but the Tamil Tiger is naked, bound, blindfolded, and executed. And this happened again and again through the final stages of the conflict. And so through the illustrations, we're able to show that and weave that into the narrative of what people experienced and lived through. We were also able to show issues that were so sensitive and so difficult to kind of talk about and portray as someone's experience of surviving torture. And there we worked, Lindsay and I went to a facility called Freedom from Torture in North London. That's a psychosocial facility that helps survivors of torture. And from 2011 onwards, Sri Lankan survivors became their most common clients. And so we would, because this was such a sensitive and difficult topic for us to record, for them to talk about, we chose to actually do all of the interviews at Freedom from Torture. So we interviewed a survivor with their psychiatrist in a controlled environment, and Lindsay would make sketches while we interviewed, and that back and forth was just that it was an appropriate space to be able to conduct such sensitive interviews, that we would then be able to walk out of that and leave these people in a space that was a safe space for them to debrief afterwards. But we were able to show these incredibly difficult moments of what people survived in an experience such as torture. And then what it was like as an asylum seeker. So to arrive in the UK from those areas that I've just shown you in Sri Lanka that were rural and agricultural areas, to suddenly be on an aeroplane. So this is the protagonist that we've kind of shaped the book around, Anthony. And he's left his wife and remaining child in Chennai as refugees. He's on somebody else's passport. He's got on an aeroplane with an agent, a smuggler, and who's brought him across to Paris, then London. And what it's like for someone like that to get on an aeroplane, the first time they've ever been on an aeroplane, saying goodbye to their wife and children after living and surviving through a conflict like that, to suddenly be in this completely alien environment. And he was telling us the first thing that he did when he sat down in the aeroplane was to try and open the window, because that's what you did on any other form of public transport. And it was also the first time that he'd used the knife and fork when the food came on the aeroplane. He's grown up with rice and curry and eating with his hands. Suddenly he's trying to act normal on the aeroplane with all of this stress and eating with a knife and fork, and chicken and peas are flying everywhere, and he's getting stressed. And so we can show this whole experience of someone getting from A to B. And then what it's like to arrive in London with all of that material culture and language and visual imagery and how that bombarded him with thoughts and memories and loneliness as well, being away from his family. But it was the details. This slide on the right is for me, one of the most upsetting and saddest slides that we've produced. And it's the experience of the asylum seeker eating by themselves at night time, away from their families. They've had a Skype conversation with them during the day. They're watching their child grow up on Skype on their computer screen. They don't know if they'll see their children again, their wife again, and they've never cooked by themselves. So someone like Anthony is used to either his mother or his wife making him dinner every night and eating with the family, and suddenly he's there in this horrible little state asylum apartment and having to cook baked beans or soup and then eat by himself. And that loneliness of eating and then watching some banal TV show and reliving that traumatic experience again and again every night, and just the stresses that they're living through was something that I found, again, the comic book and the graphic novel could really take us into those details and those spaces. And then one day, it was a few years ago, I was watching Roger Rabbit with my my little nephew, and I had another one of these kind of moments watching Roger Rabbit of seeing the cartoon character running around in the real world, and I suddenly looked at all of my photographs of Sri Lanka and realised that not all the time, but where it's appropriate like this, we could actually start drawing and illustrating on top of the photograph, and that constantly reinforced to the audience that this wasn't a work of fiction, that this actually happened in a time and space. But then again, because of anonymity issues, you can remove the actual people from the photograph and illustrate on them, and weave that into the narrative, so that maybe every 10, 20, 30 pages, the audience is touched by this is real. And so that was how the PhD started to grow. And like any PhD student, I had my tantrums and I didn't enjoy the actual academic bit so much, and I wanted to kind of just do the comic. And in my second year, I thought, actually, this is a really interesting communications tool that I'm developing here. And kind of thinking back to my days at the UN of how we struggled to get some of this really interesting and important information out to non-UN policy people. No one was reading our reports. And so I set up Positive Negatives to really take these methodologies I was developing and apply them to all kinds of topics, whether it's refugees or trafficking or climate change or all these kind of issues. It didn't really matter. You could find a human narrative in all of this, in all of these stories and issues. So I kind of ran with the idea and started to engage with all the people that I'd connected with through life, traveling around the world, and started to build Positive Negatives. And we got commissioned by many organisations to do projects on drug addiction, of crack cocaine addiction in Guinea-Bissau, of trafficking, sex trafficking from Nigeria to the UK, which is an example I'll show you about in a minute, of domestic workers in Saudi Arabia from Ethiopia, of Horn of Africa migration, of climate change, etc., etc. And started to develop and build this portfolio, working with a whole array of clients. And so these were organizations that got in contact with me and said, can we do a project with you on Syrian refugees, or sex trafficking, or climate change, or civilians lost in conflict, missing people in conflict. And so we started to develop this quite large portfolio of work and employ more and more artists to work with. And we tried to find, at first, the gender needed to be right, that if we were doing a story on a female-led story like a BK, which I'll show you now, then we worked with another fantastic artist, Gabby Froden, who's a Swedish artist living in London, and how she would depict the story of a Nigerian woman coming from Nigeria and being trafficked to the UK as a sex slave. And this was a really interesting space to work with, that suddenly Gabby, unfortunately another children's an illustrator, was suddenly having to depict the experiences of this trafficked woman, and how difficult that was for her to really get into the head of this woman and show these experiences. But we found that we could start to depict the story of a BK growing up as a young girl in Nigeria, and then having a horrific time with her family, that she got married and her husband's family took away the children and she was pushed out onto the street. And so she was severed from her children, from her husband, and she one day met Mary. Mary, we've changed all the names, but Mary was a British Nigerian woman who approached a BK in a coffee shop, bought her a coffee, and started to listen to her story. And a BK, told her everything, and incredibly emotional, and felt great trust for this older British Nigerian woman. And Mary said, why don't you come to England? You can be a nanny for a lovely English family. And after 3 or 4 years, you'll have enough money to apply for a visa and get your children over, and you'll live happily ever after in London with your children. So Abike took that, and she flew to the UK. Mary looked after the passport for her and drove her straight from Heathrow Airport to her house in West London and locked her in a basement. And for a year, she was a sex slave and was raped repeatedly for about a year until she escaped. And we were able to start to show this through graphics and illustrations, that it was very important to maintain some dignity for Abike, that this didn't need to turn into pornography or voyeurism, but to show the misogyny of what someone like Abike had experienced. And so again, graphically, we were able to take you into these spaces that I don't really think you could show in other media forms, and take you inside the heads and the head and the emotions of what Abike was living through, and the experiences she had, the people she had met who had contributed to this horrific experience she was living through. And when she finally escaped, the door was left open one day. She ran out onto the streets of London. She had never been there. All she knew was the airport and this basement. And she was picked up as an illegal immigrant with no paperwork. So she was put in jail by the British state for a year. And it was a law firm that got her out. And so we started working with this law firm to tell Abike's story. And at that point, I was the only person working with positive negatives. And I didn't feel ethically right that a male should sit in front of her and interview her on this experience. And so we worked with her female law firm that went through all the methodologies I've just explained to you of the back and forth with the artwork and the script, but through her lawyers. So this was an incredibly interesting project for me that I never met a BK, and now I actually live in South London, which is a very Nigerian neighbourhood, and it kind of haunts me that every day I might walk past a BK, and this is someone that I've spent kind of 6 months with but never met her. And we finished the story. I don't know how well you can see in the lighting there, but she is now repatriated with her children. But Gabby depicted, you know, the experiences of the shadow behind her, of what she had lived through. And this became an incredibly powerful project that actually went as part of the Modern Day Slavery Act and was put on top of policy papers that went into Parliament. And what we found there was suddenly this humanised policy, that you had piles of legal paperwork on the Modern Day Slavery Act in the UK, but you suddenly saw this story visually, and parliamentarians, policy people, couldn't ignore the horrors of this story. And I've just shown you an excerpt of it. It's gut-wrenching how hard this is to read. And you put that against the legal, dry statistics, theoretical policy papers, and this suddenly is incredibly powerful to start to change people's opinions. And so we started going through this, and we started to get mentioned in the House of Lords and in Parliament of how our visual work can help shape people's understandings of these very complex issues. And this became a fascinating space that I'd never even dreamed that we could go with comics. And so in 2015, Norwegian People's Aid, an NGO in Norway, and the Nobel Peace Centre started working with us on how you tell a story about Syrian refugees. So I went out to the Zaatari refugee camps in Jordan, and on the Jordan-Syria border there, and it's now, I believe, the second largest refugee camp in the world. And I started to interview Syrian refugees who were in that camp, and I was meeting these amazing families. And I think, yeah, just to cut a very long story short, there was this wonderful family who, this guy told me the story of being imprisoned for 7 years in Syria before the war in the 80s, and he was horrifically tortured. And he told me this story in depth, and we went through this interview for about 3 hours with his wife and children sitting behind him, and he went into incredible detail of the experiences of torture. Very, very brave, solid guy who was just going through in detail. And and at the end of the interview, there was, you know, this atmosphere in his tent, and I started to pack up my belongings, and suddenly his wife just kicked off and started hitting him and shouting at him, and he was kind of looking at his feet, and my translator was laughing, and it turns out that he had told me the story so in depth, and with all the dates and ages and everything that he'd been through, that it turns out that he was 5 years older than he had told his wife, and his wife had been sitting in the background doing the maths, and the kids were laughing that actually dad was this old man, and mum was upset with him that she had married this old man, and she was kind of, so it was moments like that which kind of broke the atmosphere in the tent. And then throughout 2015, it was the first huge push of Syrian migration across Eastern Europe. So I took my motorbike and I started motorbiking all over Eastern Europe, the Balkans. This was in northern Serbia, and Syrian refugees were following these old disused railway tracks. This is on the borders of Hungary and Serbia. And it was just as the Hungarian police were bringing the first barbed wire fences across the border to stop Syrians coming into Europe. And this was like the front wall of Europe. And so I went through this whole experience with them. And on part of this trip, I was in Istanbul and met another fantastic artist, Wael Tabuji, who is a Syrian artist and animator. And we started working on how we tell these stories again through photographs and illustrations of what the Syrian people were experiencing. And I went up to the refugee camps in Scandinavia, in Sweden, in Norway, and was meeting people like Khalid. Again, all of these names have been changed. And Khalid was a 23-year-old economics student from Dara in South Syria. And he had been photographing the revolution and was arrested at the beginning of the revolution and was heavily tortured. And this was him in the safety of a Norwegian asylum camp explaining to me the experiences of how he had been strung up, of the amount of space he had to work it, to sleep in, etc. And interestingly, the safe space that he was now in, that the Norwegians were saying, you know, you're in Norway now, go and enjoy these beautiful forests, you're safe. But it was exactly those safe, quiet forests that he was reliving again and again, these traumas. And in fact, he needed to be kind of somewhere like Times Square or somewhere with all the distractions of life, not in a very quiet, safe space like a Norwegian forest. And so we started to tell his story both graphically and through animations that Wael put together with Lindsay. And then through the Mediterranean migration. So I worked with a number of respondents, Syrians, in Scandinavia, and then chose to tell 3 stories of Khalid, Hasko and Mohammed, and position the storytelling in the spaces that I had met them. And so Khalid's, it was the story of him and I walking through the forests, with him clearly suffering PTSD. I don't believe for one moment he didn't have a stick in his hand and was pulling leaves off and twigs, and was clearly a very, very upset individual of what he had experienced. And so, but it was a very interesting space to conduct such interviews of him reflecting back on his experiences of the revolution, of being taught, but then of the torture that he experienced. And this is like the photographs that he was demonstrating of how he was tied and beaten and electrocuted. And again, the comic book is a space that is a medium that can get you into that space and really start to show what someone like Khalid's experiences were. And Hasko's experience of, this is Hasko in the top there, one of Syria's most famous artists, a pretty wealthy guy, an incredibly celebrated artist, suddenly finds himself leaving his wife and children in Turkey to the vulnerabilities of being a single mother, then a lone mother in Turkey with the 4 children, and having to take this absolutely wretched, terrifying journey for 11 days across the Mediterranean, and where his complete dignity was stripped, of being vomited on, of going through just the horrors of being on this boat. And, you know, the media is constantly showing us these boats arriving in Greece and Italy, but not the journey. And the comic was able to take the audiences on that journey and see what it was actually like. And it was absolutely horrific. And for these stories, because Khalid, Mohammed and Hasko were in a safe space, they had received asylum, and they allowed us to use their photographs at the end. So we finished each comic with a portrait like this to really show again and reinforce the fact that you haven't just read a comic book, this is a piece of non-fiction. So we started connecting with the media and putting these out and getting massive views. We got 92 million viewers in 5 days for our project on crack cocaine addiction in Guinea-Bissau. We got 650,000 views for Almaz's project about an Ethiopian woman in Saudi Arabia as a domestic maid. Started getting double-page spreads in The Guardian and exhibitions at the Nobel Peace Centre and all of this stuff, and the company started to grow, and we were it was incredibly exciting, and putting out our comics in multiple languages. And this is something that, again, was very easy with the comics, that we would work with the client and they would do the translations of the script, and we were able to put the script in multiple languages back into the speech bubbles. I think Lindsay does get slightly concerned that when we translate our Sri Lanka book into Tamil, the Tamil script is huge, and where are we going to put this script in the speech bubbles that it might not all fit? But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And we found that the comic book hit literacy levels, that this was a Syrian elder in the Zaatari camp who was reading. He couldn't read the words, but he could understand the story visually of a Somali comic, and he's laughing there that this particular bit in the comic is the Somali father telling his children that the stars in Somalia are the best in the world, and he's obviously finding that hilarious because obviously Syria has the best stars in the world, and what are these Somalis talking about? But the fact that he understood the script, and he was such a lovely guy to work with. And now we're based at SOAS, as Shireen gave the kind introduction. I'm now working at SOAS with all of this media and how you take academia and policy and present it in different mediums. And at SOAS, we're able to work with the SOAS Radio and obviously the international student body. So we're starting to make podcasts of taking something like Almaz's story of the Ethiopian maid in Saudi and the very, very difficult experiences that she found herself there, and turn these into, does that go? Yep.
Every morning, I would wake up at 5 a.m. I prayed before starting work. First, I mopped all the floors in the whole building. Then I moved on to the windows. They were beautiful, but it took so long to get the dust from the previous night off.
So we're starting to adapt all of these into podcasts. And the lovely thing about SOAS is that that's Caroline, one of the women that work with me, who's adapted the script to a podcast. And now when I go back, we're going to find an Ethiopian student who will record it in English, Amharic, Oromo, and Arabic. And then we can put these out as podcasts for a whole new medium. And starting working more and more with animations. So this is a little clip from a project that we've just done on intersex issues in Uganda.
One day, my story was leaked to a newspaper in Uganda. Everybody wanted a piece of me. They wanted to dissect me. I was so afraid. I escaped to South Africa.
And you can see all of this work on our website. And this is a 4-minute animation that we're really proud of. It's on LGBTI issues in Uganda and one man's testimony. And so it was last year. I thought, okay, this is all going really well, and we're producing all these comics. We're producing, I think, nearly 22 comics and animations this year across 17 countries, and that's going great, but what's the impact of this? That it's great to get a double-page spread in The Guardian, but who am I talking to? What are my audiences? And actually, I'd kind of at the moment prefer to get a spread in Barbright website or the Daily Mail or some more right-wing kind of publication to kind of reach audiences that aren't so sympathetic or come from the same school of thought. So I'd always been going into schools, and I found secondary school students were really engaged with this form of storytelling. And so last year we set up Y Comics, and that was to take all of these comics that Positive Negatives produces and take them out to secondary schools around the world. And so another SOAS alumni, Emma, and we set up Y Comics together as this charity. And I can show you on the website. So this takes a whole portfolio, and this is what's now based at SOAS, to take them out. And these are projects, lots of different projects that we're working with. And we're now working in nearly 600 schools across 26 countries. And the idea was to take one, if we look at a BK, for example, which is the one that we've just seen about the trafficked Nigerian woman. And so students can read and engage with Abike's story, and as they're reading it, behind the comic, there's constant engagement with different issues, such as trafficking issues like this, from UNICEF, which on the global economies and roots of trafficking. And so students can really start to build their their understanding through the human-led single narrative visually, but constantly engage with human rights issues, trafficking issues, maps, etc., multimedia. We then started to make teaching resources, understanding that teachers are incredibly busy, and so to deliver this into the classroom with understandings of how you would use this in the classroom. So we can break it down into age groups, subject matter, topics, issues like this. And I downloaded one earlier. So then the teachers can get a whole classroom exercise of how they will use this for homework activities and etc. And so we're now working with our team at SOAS to turn all of this material into this kind of educational resources and spread that out into secondary schools around the world. And now we are working across these 700 schools as the pilot test. And I'm sure that's something that will grow and grow as teachers share it amongst teacher networks. And these are the projects we're working on this year, from anything from climate change to experiences of refugees in Libya, to human rights defenders of the Roma, etc. And all of these will go through that same process of the methodologies of working with the respondent out into the media, and then gone through this process to go out into schools through Y Comics. And that's what we do. I never know how to finish. The end. Thank you.
That was amazing. Would you like to field your own questions?
Yeah, if there are any. Yeah. Yes.
So in addition to being able to view all the comics on the website, is it also possible to download them and print them out?
Yes. Yeah. I really don't believe in copyright. We produce them and they're out there in the world. So print them, share them. I went back to Ethiopia and saw some of our work. The Almaz one that had been printed, it's 10 pages, stapled together, and it was all thumbed and dog-eared where it had been shared around a classroom, and that was wonderful to see that these things could be shared in a very low-tech way. You know, they look nice on the BBC websites, but they can just be printed out and shared. So yeah, please share them.
Just another follow-up question. Does all your funding come from the university, or is it positive, negative, a company or a nonprofit?
So Positive Negatives is a non-profit, and we get commissioned by anyone really, the UN, the Red Cross, now SOAS, to produce these comic books. But we're in a nice position to say no to some projects as well. I had a nice experience last year of saying no to the UK Home Office, that we didn't want to do a project on migration of Syrian refugees coming into the UK. That was a nice position to turn down some work. Yeah.
I was wondering if you would prefer, like, for example, if it's a project in Nigeria, if you favor a Nigerian sketch artist compared to a British sketch artist, or it doesn't really matter, it's based more on quality of work, or how do you make that decision?
So yes, that's exactly where we're trying to head towards. I mean, I think we're, like any company or initiative, it has to organically grow. But my kind of dream is that if we're doing it for the future, if we're doing a project on a Nigerian woman, then it will be a female Nigerian artist that will draw it. And that's something we're getting closer and closer to. So now we work with artists from the Middle East, North Africa region, MENA. We work with artists who have Nigerian backgrounds but are living in the UK. And our database of artists are growing. But certainly we try and, at the very least, we fit the right gender for the artist, and slowly we'll start to have the right cultural backgrounds as well. And that's something that will just kind of organically grow, really. Each time we put out a project, lots of artists contact us and we get the database gets bigger. Yeah.
So I want to thank you. It was really it was excellent.
Thank you.
Because I do a lot of documentary films, and how more creative it is to do it, to take a very difficult subject and put it in images of comic rather than the reality of interviewing people and so forth. But I have two questions. One was, did you also use that last picture, which I thought was really difficult for me to see, the UN leaving the northern Sri Lankan?
Yeah.
Did you also try to do two things? One, present it in a comic sort of imagery, but also use what you said to go into those difficult spaces and look at how people felt as they were leaving that particular space. I think that's also something that you might want to think about, how to present it. It basically shows people who are left behind a kind of both empathy and recognitions of some of the pain that some of the UN officials, whatever, were living with. But that's an aside. The second is all of these stories that you're doing is about what really affects Europeans. For example, I'm half Eritrean. So something about what affects Italy with all these refugees coming from Eritrea. So that would be something to draw on that experience. But I'm more interested of why they are leaving. And so have you also thought about going into some of these areas and asking them, what do you want to see us do that we have not done? I mean, it's not about what Europeans are going through, because half of the time they created the problems.
Sure.
But what are the issues internally that will make it more livable for you to stay where you are?
Yeah.
The questions of authoritarian regimes, victimization of women, all of these. I didn't see that here. I mean, I just saw what afflicted some of these European states,
Sure.
and that's not something that
Okay.
concerns me.
Okay. Well, then I apologise. That's a failure of my presentation. But three questions there. The first one on the on the UN evacuation and the positionality of the UN official. That's my story, of which I suffered from post-traumatic stress at the end of the Sri Lankan conflict, and that's not something that I wanted to tackle in this graphic novel on Sri Lanka. I wanted to tackle it from the Sri Lankan perspective, and partly of that is that I'm not ready to work with that story of me. That is an incredibly personal and traumatic story. It's not that I'm not prepared to share it, I'm just not strong enough to share it yet. So in the future, as I get through this is a huge issue in my life that one has to personally tackle and get through. And when I get to that stage, maybe I start telling that story more and more. But I'm not there yet, so I work with the Sri Lankan story. From the perspective of the European issue, so a lot of what I've shown you today has been commissioned work by the media or by organisations that want something for the International Day of Refugees or the International Women's Day, or et cetera, and unfortunately quite often we get commissioned in a quite short period where the commissioner needs something in 2 months, and therefore we have to tell a quite linear story for a particular perspective, International Refugee Day or how this is affecting Europe, et cetera. What I'm enjoying now in a more academic space is that we have much longer to work with. So the academic projects I'm working on now, which also comes back to your question about the artists, I suddenly have space to breathe and plan and think about the different perspectives of the story that I'm telling. So hopefully they won't just be a linear story of I was trafficked and this is my situation in Europe. Because that project we did in 3 months. Now the academic projects, we have 3 years to do it, so we can bring in all kinds of different perspectives and make much more holistic projects, which is really exciting for myself and our team. In terms of the perspective of Eritrea compared to Europe, this was a project that we did for the Overseas Development Institute about a woman's experience of coming to the UK from Eritrea. And the first third of this project is about her being conscripted in Eritrea, is about her working in the tax revenues of Asmara, of her being arrested where she was plotting to leave and being held in a container in Eritrea, of them plotting to leave with her colleagues and making the escape from Eritrea to the refugee camps of Ethiopia, across crocodile-infested rivers, and the whole journey through Sudan, the Sahara, the extortion and violence she went through with the different tribes in the Sahara, etc., etc. The sexual violence in Libya, all of these kind of experiences. So the first, I think, 2/3 of the book are before she even gets to Europe. So we really did try to show the experiences of why she was leaving Eritrea. But again, this was quite a quick deadline for the production of this. And now I'm working with a Dr. Laura Hammond at SOAS, who we're looking at migration from Horn of Africa. And again, we have time to really work on different perspectives and maybe do a whole separate project about the issues, the push issues from the Horn of Africa before you get to the pull issues of Europe, right? And that's something as an organisation we'll just grow, and it's definitely something we're thinking about. Yeah. Yeah.
This is just incredibly inspiring, and congratulations on the success. And these are just phenomenal projects. And,
Thank you.
You know, it's amazing. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is at various points you're also telling the story of the various artists that you've engaged with. And in the case of your Sri Lankan story, you said something to the effect of, I brought my colleague. I brought him a genocide, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And he was a children's artist, and
Sure.
so how are you seeing that their voices and their struggles with these stories are both coming out in the work or in terms of giving them support, training, etc., to engage with this work?
Yeah.
And how does that set of relationships between them, the participants and whose lives these are, and their own artistic trajectory, I guess, in
Yeah.
their careers?
Want to explain where this question's
Okay. So Lindsay, it was really as Lindsay embarked on this Sri Lanka story, it rapidly turned into a very big project. It clearly wasn't going to be 2 or 3 months and we'll just knock out this little story about Sri Lanka. We didn't quite realise it would turn into me standing here talking to you all, but it was important that Lindsay came to at least South India and saw what the flora, fauna, culture of Tamil society looks like. It wasn't perfect because it wasn't North Sri Lanka, but because of my political relationship with Sri Lanka at the time and the security of the respondents in Sri Lanka, it was better that we stayed in South India. And then his relationship with the country, he now actually lives in a Sri Lankan Tamil area of East London, so he's surrounded by all that material culture of Sri Lanka. He's watched all of the film footages. He's been part of a journey together with me for the last 5 years, so he's really embraced that Tamil culture, and that comes out in his artwork. But he's always remained, he's very, I think, clear with his boundaries, that he's the artist, and I think he struggles with the responsibility of what he's doing, that these are incredibly complex and very, very sensitive stories. That does he feel like he's doing it justice because it's so responsible what he's doing? I think, and everyone who's seen the artwork says yes, they are, but he struggles with that. I'm very aware that he's actually probably watching as well. It's quite strange to. And Gabby, going through the Abike project, I know that the Trafficking Women's project was incredibly difficult for her. This is a woman in her 30s living in London who actually has an Eritrean sister, an Ethiopian sister, and I know she really struggled with this, hour and hours per day of drawing these horrific scenes of this woman being locked in a basement and being, repeatedly sexually violated. Where I know she felt very isolated in herself for those months drawing that work, that she, at the end of the day of drawing these scenes, she didn't want to go out with her friends to the bar, and she started to experience that trauma. And again, that's something that I really want to think about directing this company, is how we look after our artists, and do we offer counselling as people go through these stories? Do we how do we debrief? How do we work with this? And fortunately, I mean, it's not surprising, we have a very empathetic team of people working at Positive Negatives, and we all kind of work together as a family and help each other through some of these struggles. But it's something that we're very aware of how do we look after our team. I mean, I'm the one who's been out in the field most and been through these conflicts and work like that, but I also need looking after, and how do we go through those processes? So we're not there yet, like, I guess, answers to a lot of these questions. We're growing, but we're thinking about how we do this. What I do find from the artists, though, is that these are such important projects, and it's not about them being headline stories and getting the work out into the Guardian and success as an artist. It's the fact that, these artists, Gabby, Lindsay, Asia, Rob, that we work with, read these stories and feel these stories, and are feel very privileged to be able to be in a space to tell them visually to the world, and that's really wonderful for them as artists to be able to have that space. Yeah.
Thanks for the wonderful presentation.
Pleasure.
I'm just wondering, as you started this project as a PhD, what theoretical background have you depended on, and how did you manage to get with your committee in the exams, for example?
What did I?
What theoretical background
Yes.
have you based your work on? I mean, from literature, and how could you convince your committee in exam about this work?
Sure. So I really went through a very personal process in my thesis of explaining my own kind of positionality as the trauma of the researcher, which I think was something that hadn't been done so much before. Certainly my examiner was very moved, but also encouraged the fact that it was a male anthropologist who spoke about their own trauma. It wasn't always the trauma of the other, and I'm this stoic researcher. This experience messed me up. It hurt, and it was a visceral experience that I needed to get out into the thesis. So it was an incredibly personal journey with that thesis, and really looking at that processes of looking at of Maus, of Palestine, of Persepolis, of different artworks, and how we take either a personal journey like Art Spiegelman or a third-person story like myself. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? My examiners.
Yes.
Yeah. So my supervisors were incredibly encouraging throughout that whole process. My examiners, I think, really enjoyed the novelty of going through that process from traumatic, complex testimony to artwork, yeah, it seemed to go right. Yeah.
So I'm really curious about how this sort of, you mentioned how this impacts the way people read or engage with policy documents, but I'm also kind of interested in the boomerang, which is how this is impacting policy, the way people who create policy are thinking about asylum, because I'm kind of thinking about the performativity of certain kinds of discourses of suffering in order to get asylum, and I'm wondering how this plays into it, and if you know from your connections with policymakers, if people are reimagining things or thinking about asylum in with regards to these kinds of narratives.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I guess we want to the kind of monitoring and assessment of what we're doing at the moment is the next stage for us. So we've now got quite a large, substantial portfolio of work, and a portfolio that's growing, and the Y Comics charity is something that was very much about the impact of getting this out into schools. But now we really want to start monitoring of how this is affecting people, and if it's changing policy, or how we can work with these different audiences, and then exactly that, of bringing it back to how this is shaping the experiences of asylum seekers and how they can relate to that kind of stuff. So I think that's one of the next things that we're really starting to look at, is exactly this monitoring assessment. So it's quite difficult for me to answer that question right now, but hopefully this time next year I'll be able to have an idea of that. Because keep in touch, and but that's something that is important, because I can give presentations like this, and I think people engage with what we're doing, but exactly what is the impact? And that's something now we really need. I think to further our projects, we really need to kind of tackle that and see what that is. Yeah. So sorry, I don't have an answer for that right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Your work is very, very interesting.
Thank you.
My question for you is regarding your methodology. You seem very cognizant and aware of how you engage with these issues, but I was wondering if you've had any problems with the people who you're writing about or portraying, if they've asked you to take anything down, or if they've asked you to modify anything, and kind of how do you hold yourself accountable
Sure.
to that? Yeah.
No is the correct answer. Is the easy answer for that. The only, which is quite a humorous story, the only issue that we had of modification was a Somali woman in Leicester, Shamso, who was this wonderful woman, mother of 6 children, and the artist drew her in an abaya, and she worked in a samosa shop, and through the interview she was saying she makes 3 samosas and she eats 1 samosa, and the artist drew her with quite substantial hips, and she kind of asked for those to be calmed down a little bit. And so that was a slight editing process that we went through. And I think she was kind of being a bit tongue-in-cheek. But because of those methodologies that we go through of working with people and that back and forth, I think, there are a lot of checks and balances there before something goes out. And I really can't think of anything where we've had any issues from any stories that we've put out from the respondents, that they've been quite happy with how we've portrayed the story.
And just a follow-up.
Yeah.
When you sit down, you have a translator, correct?
Yeah, if needed, yeah.
And do they translate word by word everything they say?
I mean, you get good and bad translators, and there's been a few translators after the end of the first day I've realised they're not, especially if it's a political issue and you realise you're working with a translator who's got their own perspectives, and I've had no problems with having to stop working with that translator and find another one. Quite often, because we've been working so far with projects that have been commissioned by the Red Cross or the UN, when the whole field work trip is facilitated by them, so then we have an in-house translator from UN Women or UNICEF or the ICRC who can translate for us. But yeah, it's not ideal. And again, this is something that's quite exciting for us now based at SOAS, that we want to train up postgrad students who will be able to go off and do the research with us because they've got the right language backgrounds, etc. And so again, that's something that will grow and I believe make our organisation stronger and more ethical and more engaging. Because it's, why am I interviewing an Eritrea? I don't speak the language, and we'll get there, Thanks. Yeah.
Great. But my question was, I think you talked a little bit about it, but how do you, because you're commissioned by these, a lot of these NGOs or international organizations, and I was just wondering how you maintain this relationship throughout the process, especially, you've talked a little bit about it, but, because a lot of these organizations have specific ideas of what they want you to present, and if you've ever had any conflict with them regarding that, or how much do they actually see the process, or do they only see the final product, or anything like that?
Okay, I'm going to answer that without naming names. There have been by far the majority of organisations that we've worked for have been really hands-off, and it's been wonderful. The Norwegians by far being the best. It's just like they, here's the budget, here's what we need you to do. You're the experts in making comics. We're here for you. If you need us, go and do it. And that's wonderful, like just go and do it. There are other organisations on the other end of the spectrum that suddenly become experts in making comics overnight and need to be micromanaging every step of the way. And that's really difficult to work with because we need to be creative, and lots of these organisations, just their bureaucracy is not creative, and it can be quite difficult. I'm sure you can imagine who I might be talking about. But and so we go through those processes that are they can be challenging, but by far the majority of organisations that we're working with, have seen our portfolio, have seen the way we tell, and they want to tell. Yes, they have to. They've commissioned us for a communications tool for their organisation, but really what they want is a linear story of a refugee, of a trafficked person, of a Syrian going through this conflict, etc. And what we tend to do is produce a script and maybe one or two scripts from different perspectives of people, and then sit down with the client and say, okay, look, this is the research we've got, these are the stories we've got, which story are we going to use? And so then, we go through that process with them. And client, but the majority of clients have been pretty hands-off and just let us produce. But we keep a very, very close relationship with them. I never kind of surprise them with the end product at the end. So we go through, they sign off on the script, they sign off on the storyboard, and then once they've signed off on that, there can be no more changes because you can't go back and start doing the artwork, rechanging it. That's a lot of time. So it's a close relationship, and actually the clients have really enjoyed it because I know from sitting on that side of the desk at the UN, my job was a lot of report writing, and suddenly you're working on a project that every day you're getting comic book illustrations coming through, and it's pretty nice, refreshing change for your day-to-day work. So there's been a pretty good relationship with the clients.
All of the stories you presented follow one person's narrative. Do you ever fictionalize where you're combining stories to create kind of a paradigm of experience, or is the documentary aspect most important?
So the Sri Lanka one is the only one where we've had an amalgamation of multiple testimonies. So the guy that I presented to you, Anthony, the protagonist, he doesn't exist. He's an amalgamation of many stories, of many interviews, partly because the enormity of the project, it's kind of very difficult to get that from one person, and also at the beginning because of security issues. We needed to bring in lots of different people and kind of fictionalize them. So I feel that Sri Lanka project is a work of kind of non-fiction fiction, if you like. But what we've gone through a methodology that all of the major events that happened in that graphic novel have happened to people and are reinforced with documentation, photo documentation, etc., as I presented to you. The other stories like this one on Mirha, this is one woman's narrative. And so, the Sri Lanka one is that amalgamation of different stories. And then obviously a fictionalization of making a narrative, a 280-page narrative out of all of those issues as well, has gone through a fictionalization process in itself. And now these, like I've said before, they're working on these academic projects now. That's going to be really interesting because we've got that time and space to maybe, instead of doing one project like this, we do two projects from two completely different political perspectives or cultural perspectives or whatever, and make two projects out of it that come as one. That's really important, of the positionality of the respondents. But again, we need time to kind of develop that, which we're now having, which is great. Yep.
Have you been approached by Save the Children or other groups that specifically are trying to meet the needs of these vast migrations, the special needs that children have?
Of children, Save the Children, we haven't. We've done stuff with Care International, but that wasn't on children. We've done work on mothers with children, and the story is very much about the mother's struggle with it. So we did a big project on Yazidi women for Care International, which was beautifully illustrated by Asia, a Libyan artist that we're working with in the UK. And she did this, which was very much about the experience of the mother, the Yazidi woman escaping ISIS, and the effects on her children as they came to Europe. And Asia is this amazing, Libyan artist who draws in Japanese manga. I mean, I love the effects of it. It's great. And she's working with us right now on a project for UN Women on an Iraqi woman's experience of going through the conflict at the moment with her children as well. No, we haven't worked with a specific project on children, but we will be working on primary comic books for primary schools. So we're looking at doing homelessness, xenophobia, and divorce of children growing up and going through divorced families and how that affects them. And so at the moment, our entire portfolio is aimed at secondary schools because of a lot of the safeguarding issues of our content, sexual violence and these kind of issues. But we're looking more and more at primary. But yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of stories we could focus on from the perspective of the child, definitely. We'll get there, I'm sure. Yeah.
For some of the people that you interviewed, was this process of telling their story therapeutic for them, or was it just very painful, or what was the effect on them of telling their story?
I mean, I think to answer that, like one of the more interesting ones was the pieces that we did on torture, where we were working at this Freedom from Torture facility. And we found there, that was it's such a hard thing to tell, to go through, for a respondent to take me back into that room where they were bound and beaten and tortured, but then to see the work depicted artistically, their psychiatrist was saying, this is really very therapeutic to suddenly be able to see it. That room that they've described to us. And Lindsay, I think, did an amazing job of really illustrating that and put his own sensitivities into the way he's depicted it artistically. But yeah, those they're incredibly painful stories to go back through. And, we take a lot of time. We're not in a rush for those things. That we take the time, we explain what we're going to do, and the process that we're going to work with. But what I've found is I can't think of anyone who hasn't any respondent who hasn't immediately connected with the idea of their story being depicted like this. They've really enjoyed that medium, and part of it, I think, is the unobtrusive nature of interviewing people without cameras. Like, I don't need to put a camera in front. I've worked on documentaries before where you have to put a camera in someone's face and then you have to stop the interview because there's a dog barking outside, or you have to hurry them up because the sun's going down and you're going to lose the light. For comic books, you can just sit there under a tree, the dogs can bark, it can turn to nighttime, and you can just listen and talk, and that in itself brings in a really unobtrusive, natural kind of, it becomes a conversation. And that's been a very nice space to... Absolutely. I normally travel, I don't go digitally, I normally travel with an A4 folder with just 5 or 6 of the comics printed out. And it's like, this is what we're going to do with your story. And immediately, there's also something like that's kind of cool with comic books that people have been like, I want to be a comic book character. There's a connection there. Yeah. It's after working as a photographer and with documentaries, interviewing for comics is really lovely process.
And because you review it with them ahead of time, it would give them, I would think, some sense of power over
Yeah,
what happened.
absolutely, an ownership of their story, and that's a big part of it. It's you know, these aren't our stories. Yeah, pleasure. Oh dear.
Can I hold the last one and then no, it's a good question. Well, so one of the things I was wondering.
Can we be the judge of that?
Well, I'm wondering because you're talking so much about the medium, the power of the medium to do all of these things. But then you're also having so much ethical responsibility and empathy is what's guiding the work. So I'm thinking, well, if it's the medium that's powerful, and this has long been the history of comics, right, that it's a ground up phenomenon, but then it gets appropriated by totalitarian regimes, authoritarian regimes, etc. And so, and the Silence and Disney Corporation, you know, there's all kinds of other ways to harness that media. So what's to stop, say, the Sri Lankan government from making their counter, and like the violence that would impose on the person, right, to see their stories completely messed with or denied or obliterated? And would that have the same kind of power, or is there something about the truthiness and the empathy that's leading into the power of these images and stories?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the Sri Lanka, when we did this documentary, No Fire Zone, the Sri Lankan government made their own documentary counteracting our documentary. And you know, took it scene by scene and said how this couldn't have happened and disregarded everything in our documentary. Yeah, they and well, I think actually if the Sri Lankan government did that, that's their reality, that's their story that they want to tell, and actually the story that I'm telling, I think, is problematic in the sense that it's telling the story of a Tamil survivor. It's not telling the story of a Sri Lankan soldier who is now 10 years later traumatized by what they saw and what they encountered.
Yeah, they're not going to do their story. Say they do every Tamil tiger is a terrorist, a murderous villain, and a beast, and a non-human to validate the genocide.
Yeah, yeah.
Would that be also powerful, or would it read to us like propaganda?
Propaganda, I think. Yeah, exactly.
That ruins the aesthetic because it has to resonate with this empathy?
I think so, yeah. I mean, what I'm doing, we're not really putting politics into our comics. We're not putting religion into our comics. What I really like about them, I'm just telling someone's story. You know, and actually the interviews that I went through on the Syrian project, I didn't ask them if they were supporters, or if they were for or against the Syrian regime. I'm not interested. That's not coming into it. It's about the human experiencing migration and becoming a refugee. I'm not really too concerned on where your politics lies or what your religion is. It's your human experience that I'm trying to portray. So to twist that into propaganda is a very, very different project. And it's not something I'm really interested in doing. That was a great question.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me.
Thank you. Cheers.